First of all, as I often do, I want to start my video with a little disclaimer. Guys, I am aware that USSR was not perfect. But the video is not about that. For the critics of USSR, you can go to capitalist-leaning channels that will cherry-pick the worst moments and represent them as the whole story. Channels that use the capitalist definition of freedom and consumerism as the only valid benchmarks of success, and the channels that basically ignore the social achievements of USSR that helped millions of people, you like it or not. In this video I want to highlight another angle of the vision of the whole story. And first of all, let's talk about universal and free education. In USSR, the right for free education was actually embedded into the USSR constitution. And unlike in some other constitutions, this right was not just theoretical right, it was actually something that really was working. Everyone had access, not only to the free education in kindergartens, in primary schools, but also the higher education was absolutely accessible and completely free. Because the access to universities was based on merits and not on wealth. Now, compare it to the USA. Under the socialist system, by 1959, the USSR almost achieved 100% literacy. I think indeed it was 98.9, which I remember was 1% even higher than the official statistics of USA at the same year. Also keep in mind that this huge jump in the progress, in the education, in the innovation in the USSR, it was possible not only because of the talent of its people and because of the priorities that the government chose, but also under the huge economic pressure from the rest of the world, the richest part of the world. Because USSR was not operating in vacuum, it was operating in a capitalistic system, and the amount of sanctions, embargoes, and other ways of economy war that was placed on the Eastern Bloc in general, it was huge. That, for example, Western powers refused to recognize the USSR diplomatically for a quite big period of time, and in 49, for example, the US and its allies established COCOM, which is Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, which basically restricted exports of advanced technology, machinery and strategic materials to the Eastern Bloc. So now imagine if the USA were placed under the same amount of horrible sanctions from the rest of the world. I wonder how easy that would be for USA to develop its wealth. I'm saying this just because a lot of guys are using this argument like, oh, USSR was poor, that's why it's, according to them, is kind of evidence that the socialist or communist system has failed. Well, of course not. It was because, unfortunately, the rest of the world was aggressively a capitalist system, and they were not afraid of the military power of USSR, which as well. They were mostly afraid of the fact that if this system will show itself to be working, to be actually able to make people happy, satisfied, then this system will spread across the globe, and the few percentage of privileged by the capitalist system, they will lose their power, and that was the most scary thing for them. And still, despite of all of this pressure, USSR were able to develop advanced technologies. Just think about the space. The first man who was able to be launched into space and survive, Yuri Gagarin, Sputnik, and in general there were a lot of advances in a lot of fields, like in nuclear technologies, aerospace technologies, and also cultural advances. Let's not discard those one to think about the ballet, the sport achievements, about the figure skating, a lot of stuff. Another thing, in the USSR, housing was considered, again, a human right that was actually respected, guaranteed by the Soviet constitution. Homelessness virtually didn't exist, or were super rare. Now compare this to your country. Heating, electricity, water were either free or extremely low on cost. And yeah, there were no real estate market, which means not only bad things, like some of you might think, but also it meant that there's no evictions, no landlords jacking up prices using this whole crazy crisis for their own profits, and no gentrification, because housing considered to be a public good and not a tool for speculation or for investment. I mean, of course, it was not perfect. Soviet buildings, Soviet housing, they often were small, maybe not super ergonomically amazing, and to be honest, I've been living in different types of Soviet flats, and I must say it was not so horrible. I mean, when I was living alone, and if you organize your space in a neat, clean, tidy, ergonomical way, you actually can live perfectly fine. But anyway, I agree on that, it was not the perfect housing. But you also know what it was not, apart of not being perfect. It was not a lifetime source of stress, debt, and sometimes super long-term insecurity if you are still paying your mortgage. So the idea that society can provide housing for everyone is not a utopia. It actually happened. Now let's talk a bit about public transportation and urban planning. As probably you already know, Soviet cities, they were built around public transportation, not around private cars, which by the way is way less ecological thing, to promote heavy use of private cars. Public transport in Soviet Union was efficient, extensive and very affordable. Basically, trolley buses, trams, metro, they were given access to almost any part of the city to anyone, even the poorest citizens. Fares were extremely cheap. And even smaller cities, small towns, they had a very robust public transport that gave them access to bigger cities and inside of the small towns too. Why? Because the public transport was built for the people's needs, not for the needs of profit of private companies. And of course, I should also mention Soviet metro. It was not only a transit for people, it was a temple of beauty, a propaganda of beautiness, not just by itself, but of course beautiness of labor, beautiness of working class, which is the one that actually built the economy of any country and sustain it. To no surprise, urban planning was also based on needs, not on market situation or market forces. That means that practically every neighborhood had their own school, kindergarten, clinics, pharmacies, shops, and public transport access within 10-minute radius. And the green zones were beautifully integrated in almost any residential area. And what about job security? And you guessed it right, full employment was again a constitutional right guaranteed by Soviet constitution. It guaranteed that you would have a job and you would be paid for it. The unemployment in USSR was virtually non-existent. But, of course, apart from having obvious positive sides, I also have to mention a few nuances. Before the World War II, Soviet government made a decree or a law that forbid people to change jobs freely. It was dictated by the military needs. Basically, the state needed people in a certain areas, which were military areas, so they couldn't let them just freely move wherever they want. But this law was cancelled in, I think it was 1956. So after this, you already were able to change jobs if you wanted. But also, a thing to keep in mind, after finishing university or another higher educational institute, you had to work for 3 years in a company that state would assign you. Basically, somehow to pay back the investment that government made in your education. Which, if you ask me, I think it's pretty fair. And to be honest, I would be freaking happy if I had a job assigned to me after I finished higher education here in Europe or in Russia that time. So I don't see it as such a horrible thing. After 3 years, then you was free to move to whichever place that was ready to take you in. And another important thing, that labor was not only considered as your right, but also as your civic duty. And chronic refusal to work might have resulted in some consequences. It was called parasitism, and actually it was a criminal offense if you were not working during an extended period of time. If you ask me personally, I think that definitely there are better ways to manage people who refuse to work and have the strong tendency for a parasite lifestyle than criminalizing it. But, well, the reality was different. But also, in return, people got a lifetime job security, certain social status, and in general, the serious lack of stress that a lot of Western people have and had before, stress related to the fear of losing a job. It was just non-existent. Companies were state-run and they just couldn't fire anyone just for saving money. And no one had to hustle on many jobs just to survive, because despite the salaries in USSR, they were not higher, they were modest, low if you wanna call it, but also the education was free, the medication was free, and the transportation was super cheap. Basically, the salaries that you had, in most of the cases, it was enough to live quite comfortably. Because it's not like that many things that you need for happiness, unlike what a consumerism culture tries to persuade us in. Another really important topic is childcare and maternity leave. And paid maternity leave was, what a surprise, guaranteed by the state and was quite generous. By the 70s and 80s, it included 56 paid days before birth and 56 paid days after birth. And even it was possible to extend them more in the case of complicated pregnancies, births, and health problems. But even without any complication, still women was able to extend it significantly. But in this case, after the 56 days after birth, it would be unpaid leave. And still, they were able to retain their workplace. It was guaranteed that they were coming back to their job and the same seniority level. And of course, the state covered all the costs of birth and maternity leave. And then, especially nice bonus. Nurseries and kindergartens were widely available. and free or extremely cheap. In fact, many truly large workplaces, they even held built-in childcare facilities so that working mothers were able to be relatively close to their kids. Basically, childcare was state-funded, secular, and focused not only on supervision, but also on very early education. Now imagine paid birth, paid maternity leave, guaranteed job return, and free childcare, not as a benefit, but as your actual human right. And that was a reality for millions of Soviet women. Now the comparison to the US, I'll leave to you. Just as a word of conclusion. This video doesn't deny that USSR had problems. Of course it had. But this video just highlights specific things the USSR did better than the US. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe ask yourself why.